Welcome back to our final module of building a private cloud with Windows Server 2012 and System Center 2012 SP1. I'm Simon Perryman, Microsoft Technical Evangelist, and I'm joined again by Pete Zerger, MVP and Infrastructure Consultant. Now, up to now, we've really kind of covered the foundation of building up these different components of the cloud. We talked about our planning considerations, building the infrastructure, and then building kind of our service and automation layer with our self-service portal, our templates, and connecting all those pieces through automation. Next step as part of this module, we're really going to focus on actually building our service catalog. So basically presenting these requests to our end users, our end customers. So why don't you kind of give us an overview of exactly what we're going to drill into as part of this module?
Absolutely. So we definitely want to have a look at what needs to be in that CMDB, in our configuration management database on the service manager side of the house, to provide that friendly user experience. So that doesn't just show up by default. We have to handle some simple configurations ahead of time.
Now, you know what? I'm going to call timeout right now.
Okay.
Let's define CMDB for our people that aren't ITIL people, and then maybe we got to define ITIL as part of that. Walk us through these basic terms. What is ITIL and what is the CMDB?
I tell you what, let me cover off the overview just really quickly,
Okay,
and then I'll get you there really fast. So we're gonna talk about the CMDB, and you'll understand what that is really clearly in just a couple of minutes. We're going to look at configuring our virtualization self-service. I'm going to show you, the run books that we're dealing with here. It's not important exactly how they're put together, because you're going to build run books that correspond to your environment. We'll talk about connecting our tenants to this self-service offering in the Service Manager UI in the self-service portal, and really bringing all of this together. All of the foundation that we've built thus far is going to be leveraged in this these final steps here as we get the information from our fabric into the CMDB, allowing us to drive intuitive self-service.
Excellent. Now, this module will be approximately 90 minutes. However, we will stay on for a little longer to address some questions that we haven't got to yet.
Yeah, great. So we should be good then for 4:30ish. So let's talk about CMDB. Simon, breached the threshold there, so we're going to talk about it. The CMDB is absolutely the key to self-service. It's absolutely the single most important key to providing that very intuitive user experience when we need the full complement of approval workflow and notification capability and abstraction of the technology. So the CMDB is our collection of configuration items in our environment. So our computers, our users, our groups, our virtualization infrastructure, our applications. The CMDB is also a collection of work items. Incidents, problems, changes, service requests. So what I'm going to do, let's just jump into the UI, and I'll show you what these items in the CMDB look like in the Service Manager interface. And this should kind of close that gap for us pretty quickly.
Now, I think one other important thing to mention as part of the CMDB as well is it shows our relationships between the different components as well. How is that relevant? Why is that important?
Oh, that's totally not important, Simon. So actually, that's absolutely key. At the end of the day, if I can open an incident every time I have a problem with a particular system, with a particular service or an application, I'm establishing a relationship there between that configuration item and the work item that I've opened for it. At the end of the year, when I want to run my reports to see where have I spent the most time solving problems, where have I made the most changes, etc. That relationship is going to allow Service Manager's native reporting to give me those answers. Let me show you how easy it is to associate a configuration item with a work item. So I have here a list of business services. So by and large, these came from Operations Manager. I'll explain how we got them here.
But what are we looking at here? Which interface is this here?
Oh, sorry, wow.
You're jumping ahead into the connector.
I'm so excited about where we are. I blindfolded you and brought you here. So we're in the Service Manager console at this point, and you see it's laid out much like the other System Center consoles. We have the Outlook style workspaces over there. I'm in the configuration items workspace. So this really has some of the core content of our CMDB, our configuration management database is what that stands for, by the way. So I have here business services. So if you're a monitoring person and operations manager, we would call these distributed application models. We brought these over automatically. I'll talk about how they got here in just a minute. But my point being, here's that web app service I deployed this morning in my user acceptance testing environment. So you'll notice when I highlight this service, and I could highlight a computer or a user just as easily, and you'll notice in my tasks pane over here to the right, I get some predictable tasks to launch work item interfaces. So if I select create related incident, while I've highlighted that web service UAT, something very important happens. The relationship that I need to establish between this incident and that configuration item happens automatically. So I don't have to, I have to fill out all of these fields in terms of who my affected users are and to qualify its severity and so forth. But look at my affected items here. There's that service automatically in the UI. Now I may want to come back and add affected users as well, for example, but I can establish that relationship very, very easy. And so whether I'm dealing with this in the context of self-service or I'm a service desk analyst opening incidents for people and their computers, I have that same capability when I highlight a computer, a user, etc. But the relationships are absolutely key in my environment. Not only in that they allow me to make those associations to work items for reporting, but I can associate dependent or interdependent systems in the context of a service. So those business services, very much have layers of detail, components that have been discovered beneath them. So I actually just double-click that web service, that web app service that was deployed earlier, and there's a service components tab here that will give me a little more information about these, about the components within this service. What's really important here is that once I establish the connectivity between Service Manager and the other components of System Center 2012, I don't need to come back and import this information manually from one time to the next. It just happens for me automatically. It's very much a set it and forget it type interface. So that's configuration items in the configuration items area. Let me have a look at the work items with you quickly, and let's just sort that out. This will connect some ITIL dots for you.
Great.
So when we look at our work items, we see some terms that you're probably familiar with, even if you're not familiar with ITIL. So you've probably heard of incidents, you've heard of changes, and you've heard of problems. You may not know the difference between an incident and a problem.
What is that?
So the difference between an incident and a problem is a problem typically involves a failure that requires more research, and oftentimes a problem will encompass multiple incidents. So let's take a use case. A printer in finance fails. 5 people call in and say, hey, my printer's not working. We figure out we have a printing problem, we're not quite sure why.
So you would have 5 incidents, being those people that are reporting the issue. Beneath that, you have a single problem, which would be ultimately the root cause of this issue.
Now, here is how cool Service Manager is, and I don't have a better term for it. I can highlight all of those incidents related to my printer problem, and look what I have over here, create problem. So I've now tied them to a parent work item. When we go do our research and we solve this problem, there is a checkbox in here whereby I can tell Service Manager when we're done solving all these problems, I just want you to go close all of the related incidents automatically. So very exciting, and you'll see it right here in the UI, auto resolve incidents associated with this problem, and you're collecting all of my information here in terms of, in accordance to my process for problem management. So you can go find quick studies on ITIL and MOF out on the internet.
And I personally suggest that to our customers as kind of a good, just best practice to getting started with a Service Manager. If you're not familiar with ITIL and you see incidents, changes, release management, change management, it could just be a little, I guess, overwhelming to understand the differences between these categories and where certain items should be living, and how to really optimize them. But yeah, as Pete said, a quick, 10-minute study, review these basic definitions. It's going to really advance you as far as just understanding these core Service Manager concepts.
Yeah, the bare necessities, and I'll refrain from singing the song of the same name at this point. But I'm going to go to the library workspace for just a minute here, and I want to show you the templates within Service Manager. Service Manager is very template-based, and a template is just what you probably think it is. It's a partially completed form. If I go to the filter here, all of my interfaces within Service Manager are plain English search. I'm going to type incident, and you'll find we have some standard incident templates here. I can make a copy of these, highlighting, and I select duplicate over here. Then I can begin to customize. I might have some fields where I know what the value is going to be, so I want to automatically fill that out. Maybe I want to go in and change the urgency and the impact. My customization capabilities are really easy because I'm not starting from scratch.
Great. Now, what happens if our customers are using other third-party, service management type databases? Other types of ticketed systems, help desks, collections of information. Is there any way that we can pull that existing information, push it back into Service Manager?
So we could use Orchestrator for a purpose like that. If you have another CMDB, another service desk solution out there, I find typically it's flowing in the reverse direction. Organizations have an existing service desk solution. They see the large body of meaningful data we can populate in Service Manager on the first day of deployment, and they say, hey, wait a minute. How can I get that information from Service Manager into my other CMDB? Very common problem. One of my first interactions with Service Manager was at a Microsoft event, and they had the guy from General Mills on stage, and he said, we did more with this in like 2 hours than we did with 15 years of our existing solution. And we'll get to why that is. There's a very important reason why this is so simple, because our CMDB is going to give us the information we need to automatically populate forms, to establish those relationships between our assets, our configuration items, and the work items that are causing us time and effort and expense. Or in the case of a service request, which was another work item in the UI, the service request just denotes an activity that's not an incident. It's not something that's wrong. It's somebody asking us for something, maybe a virtual machine, new user onboarding, etc. And that's where the self-service portal comes into play, because everything we do, everything we request through the portal, through those service and request offerings will be manifested in our CMDB as a service request.
So I think, just to kind of break it down as far as these different levels of the Service Manager interface, we have our self-service portal, which is what our end users see, our non-technical people. We have our main management, Service Manager management server that, gives us a nice, easy view, gives us the details and a nice user interface. And then behind that, we have our CMDB, which is kind of like this massive aggregate set of resources. From that, we can get kind of advanced functionality like pull in data, pull in reporting. So I think the nice thing about Service Management is this different kind of layers of information that you can pull from, see information about.
Yeah, so the massive reporting data is actually in the data warehouse, where Service Manager builds for you half a dozen OLAP cubes, which we'll look at briefly. But the point being, there's some great reporting here, and you don't have to be a BI expert to use it. And an OLAP cube is going to be best viewed by somebody like me using Excel with power pivots, so pivot tables, basically. But yeah, a lot of that is being done for us in the background. The information from our CMDB is being massaged in the data warehouse into a form that's through an ETL process to basically get it into a form that it's ready for reporting. So this CMDB that you saw a lot of information there that's pretty ordinary data. As we pop back and forth in the interface here, I'm going to show you some less ordinary data and how I was able to leverage it in the UI in the self-service portal to make for a more intuitive user experience. Incidentally, I can create custom classes in my CMDB as well. Maybe I have computers that I need to denote are special in some way. Maybe I have a computer that's in Azure in my public cloud, and I want to mark it as an Azure computer. Maybe I have VMs that are over on the VMware side, and I want to make sure they're denoted in some specific way. It's very easy for me using the Service Manager authoring console to make code-free extensions of these classes to add properties to conform to what I'm trying to achieve from one use case to the next. So lots of key data types. We want to get information from Active Directory. Configuration Manager has great information from computers and the software that have been deployed, compliance monitoring. We know that VMM is touching a lot of data related to our virtualization environment. We want to try to get all of that into Service Manager. Here's how we do it. There's a connector framework, a series of connectors in Service Manager native to the platform. I can set these up with a wizard and connect into my Configuration Manager or Operations Manager environments, 2012 or 2007 incidentally. If I have multiple environments of any sort, I can run that wizard multiple times and connect into multiple environments. And you'll see here with Configuration Manager, I'm getting hardware and software information, the all-important primary user-to-computer relationship. Not so important for us on the data center side, but certainly on the desktop side, they love that. Active Directory, users, computers, groups, printers, key information. And then our virtualization information, our templates, etc. from Virtual Machine Manager. Want to point something out very important here. So no doubt the computers we see in Active Directory will many times also appear in Operations Manager, will also appear in Configuration Manager. That being said, Service Manager is going to track the authoritative source of the asset as it flows into the CMDB. It's going to update that asset with information from the other sources. So I'm not going to get 5 Web 012 computers. I'm going to get Web 012 computer with information populated from multiple sources. So these connectors are going to bring the information in. Service Manager is going to manage the life cycle of this asset for me in my CMDB. So if I can run the connector, I'm in good shape. And I tell you, I can run the wizards for these connectors really, really well. I'm a great UI guy. But these connectors facilitate not only the system center data, the Active Directory data, there's also a connector for Exchange that allows me to configure dynamic notification capability. And for those other systems, I can use orchestrator integration packs to get data from external sources, and using the Service Manager integration pack, I can use the create object activity to create a new asset in my CMDB, a new computer, a new whatever it is of whatever class I like. There's also a CSV import wizard in Service Manager that will allow me to basically import a spreadsheet with data. I have to provide a little XML mapping file that tells Service Manager what the headers, what the columns in the spreadsheet mean. Many examples out on the internet that'll make this an easy task for you. One real common source is companies want to bring their mobile device data into their CMDB, and many of them are managing that in Excel today. So that's a great source for us. We can take a spread. If you can put it in a spreadsheet, we can get it into Service Manager with relative ease. So let's switch gears and talk about integration for just a bit. How do we make these connectors work? What is the magic that populates our CMDB? So we have Service Manager, and then we have Orchestrator, our ace in the hole, so to speak, if we need to bridge some gap. So between Service Manager and Orchestrator, there is a bi-directional connector for automation activities and executing the automation workflows. Incidentally, this connector accepts the Orchestrator web service URL as one of its parameters. So Service Manager can receive a list of runbooks from Orchestrator and put those into the CMDB. It can also initiate runbooks and pass input to Orchestrator from that self-service request offering that was initiated by the user. So here are our connectors. So here are your system center components. We have our line of business and third party. So I will set up what we call CI or configuration item connectors for Configuration Manager, Operations Manager, Active Directory. I can also set up an alert connector for Operations Manager. So not only can I bring in some of the rich data that's being discovered about my applications, but maybe I want to link the alert process for key services into Service Manager to automatically generate an incident. And when the monitoring system says the problem solved, we can update that incident in Service Manager and close it out. So that connectivity from a CI perspective, a configuration item perspective, is possible, but alerts as well.
Now, we've had a couple customers asking online about Oracle. They're using Oracle for their databases. How exactly does Oracle fit in, just in general, with this whole System Center suite?
Well, so Oracle is an ODBC compliant database at the end of the day. So if I wanted to deploy an Oracle database, I could do that with Configuration Manager. with the Linux, Unix agent or Windows. Depends on where you want to deploy Oracle, frankly. From a runbook automation perspective, the query database activity, maybe my favorite activity in all of Orchestrator, will communicate to ODBC compliant databases. Oracle is actually in the drop-down list when you're configuring the connection into your database. You have to supply your credentials and the specifics of your database and your platform. Oracle's on the list. So supported and supported. If we want to monitor Oracle's health, Operations Manager through the System Center Alliance framework, you can get some third-party management packs that plug right into System Center to give us monitoring capability. So Config Manager and potentially Orchestrator together for deployment, Orchestrator for various types of automation, and Operations Manager for monitoring. So yes, yes, and yes. So I run these wizards, and these wizards are going to execute on a schedule. Once a day, they're going to bring data in. Full sync on the first pass, delta sync thereafter, so minimizing our footprint effectively. Understanding that if we have gaps we need to bridge, if we can get the data into a spreadsheet from our third-party sources, we can get that into the CMDB through the CSV import capability, or we can even write runbooks in Orchestrator to inject that information in immediately. So in my Service Manager UI, I'm going to jump down to my Service Manager console here. I'm going to go to the Administration Workspace. This is where I do the heavy lifting. There is conveniently here a connectors node. You're going to see I have many connectors in my environment. These connectors allow me to configure very granular behavior. So for example, my SCCM connector doesn't necessarily need to bring in every asset in my configuration manager environment. I can pick a specific collection. That happens to be how this one is driven. Now this one I have set to all systems, but I can filter however I like. Fairly intuitive questions. The name of our config manager database server, the database name, those trusty run as accounts. Again, I can securely store the credentials, set it and forget it. I know I have permission. I don't need to supply credentials every time. And with the new service account capabilities in Service Manager, in Active Directory, Windows Server 2012, we can begin to look at new strategies for how we manage credentials over time. Frankly, that's a beachhead I haven't even approached yet. So I run these connectors. I've got SCCM here. I have my Operations Manager CI connector, which incidentally is going to bring in some core information about certain classes of configuration items, but not all of them. So I want to point out something very telling here. So I'm looking at the Operations Manager CI connector in my environment. You'll see that I've supplied a server name. The connector's enabled. I've given it credentials, admin level rights. Look at these management packs down here. So what in the world is Service Manager doing with Operations Manager management packs? So I'll tell you a little bit of history here. Back in the day when Service Manager was born, so to speak, or conceived, its architecture, its foundation was based in part on Operations Manager architecture. So these two have a lot in common in their lineage. And Service Manager, to that extent, understands the Operations Manager management pack schema. But Operations Manager, you say, isn't a monitoring platform, and you're right. So when I import a management pack into Service Manager, an Operations Manager management pack, Service Manager knows I'm going to ignore the discovery workflows. I'm going to ignore the monitoring workflows. What I care about are the classes that are defined in those management packs that I can populate into my CMDB, and then potentially through the Operations Manager CI connector populate in my configuration management database, in my Service Manager database. So you may ask yourself, what am I monitoring? Oracle or VMware, or insert your application here, and I would like that information in my CMDB, but I notice that it's not here by default. So the bad news is, you may think it's bad news, Operations Manager, all classes discovered in Operations Manager are not injected by default, and that's actually not a bad thing at all because it controls the bloat of our database. The good news is it's very easy for us to expand on that default capability. I can actually tell Service Manager that I would like it to bring in other custom classes, that may not be included by default. So, just in my environment here, you'll notice that I have some information that's bringing in some default data. But what I've done is just created a folder with some custom views to show off my service templates. I want to point something out to you service template fans out there. I know you guys are getting on board with me. You notice the release column here? Not included by default. If you show up on Thursday, I'm going to show you how to bridge this gap. Very easy to do, very cool, and gives us that capability to present our users with multiple versions of the service templates in the self-service interface. So we'll cover that off sometime Thursday afternoon, I believe. And the last connector I really wanted to focus on with you today is the orchestrator connector. So I mentioned it's a two-way connector. Allows us to bring the runbooks in from Service Manager, allows us to drive requests to initiate runbooks, to initiate self-service requests in Orchestrator over the web service. So I'll just open up the one of my Orchestrator connectors here. They happen to be pretty functionally specific in my environment. I have something like, I don't know, 500 or 600 runbooks in my development environment. I don't want them all in Service Manager. I just want those that are interesting for self-service. So when I configure the sync folder here, I point it to a specific folder that I browse to, and you notice here I'm being prompted for my credentials. I browse to the folder, tell Service Manager where I want it to sync from using the connector, and I get a very tidy subset of runbooks from the self-service area of my Orchestrator install, which as a side note, means we need to organize our runbooks neatly in folders, perhaps by function, perhaps by unit, support unit within our IT organization, or potentially both. So you want to have a chat about that amongst your support units within the org that use Orchestrator, and figure out how you're going to manage that strategy over time. So when I synchronize that connector, I will see in my sorry, frog in my throat. I'll see in my my library here my runbooks, and so here we go. So now, if I have a good naming convention for my runbooks, which is going to be descriptive, and you see I like to use hierarchical numbers. Not really important if you do that. We actually did a talk at the Microsoft Management Summit on runbook authoring best practices. Encourage you to go find me and find that session. I did that with one of the premier field orchestrator gurus. Some great information in there to help you sort of design your orchestrator approach. So I'm just going to search on access. I knew I had some access requests to database roles, for example. Plain English search here. But now I have these runbooks in Service Manager. Service Manager is going to know what those runbook IDs are, so I can connect those to my self-service portal into these request offerings, we call them. So very quickly, I just wanted to mention, I've got back-to-back demos here, which is sort of odd, but I just wanted to cover off whitelisting additional classes through the Operations Manager CI connector, the configuration item connector. So by default, only some core types of information are coming over about computers and network devices and related information.
So what is whitelisting, and why would we want to go do that?
Great question. So there's going to come a time where I'm going to see something in Operations Manager and say, gee, wouldn't it be nice if I could have that in my CMDB so I could show that to a user in my interface. So that comes up for me all the time.
So what you're saying is, by default, Service Manager isn't going to capture every type of resource in the world, yet if Operations Manager can view it, we can go and import that resource type. From that point on, we can then start tracking it and using it as kind of an asset that we can manage.
Right. So what we have to do, there are a couple of steps. So the first thing, you noticed when I opened the Operations Manager CI connector, there was a list of management packs there. So the first thing I have to do is actually import the management pack from Operations Manager that contains the classes I want. So for SQL, for example, I imported I think it was the SQL 2008 Discovery Management Pack. If you're not an Operations Manager person, there's a Management Pack Viewer utility that will allow you to look in the management packs and see where these classes are combined. Because remember, where they're defined rather, because remember, Service Manager doesn't care about monitoring workflows, it cares about class definition. So I can import that management pack right here in the administration workspace where I do the heavy lifting. And Service Manager actually understands a superset of Operations Manager management pack in many respects. Once I have imported that class, I need to run basically one line of PowerShell to whitelist that class. And basically what I'm telling Service Manager is I want you to add this particular class to the allow class list. So what I'm going to do is import that management pack, and I will get the name of that class either through the management pack viewer in Operations Manager, or I'll go into PowerShell and start digging about with PowerShell to find that. Now I don't want to assume that we're all PowerShell gurus here, so I'm going to just show you right here. The commandlet you need to worry about is add-scsm allow list class. So I can use this command, and all you have to do is use your get help to see how this is used, or if you can do an internet search, you will find many examples of how we can add that class that was in the management pack we just imported to tell Service Manager, I want you to bring it in on your next synchronization. The final step I need to perform, I need to go find my Operations Manager CI connector, and I need to find on this Management Packs tab, I do a refresh here and see all of the management packs that have been imported that have classes, from Operations Manager. So I want you to notice on my screen here, I have my SQL library there, and I have my SQL Server 2012 library. I wanted to bring in my database servers, my SQL instances, my SQL databases. So the next time this connector ran, and I'll tell you it ran as soon as I finished saving that and hit synchronize now to sort of speed up the schedule. So let's go to my configuration items. And by right-clicking here, you can create a folder and then create custom views in the folder. Very intuitive. Create a folder, create a class view in that folder. So you'll notice I have SQL Server CIs. I abuse that common abbreviation of configuration item because CI is faster to say and quicker to type. So what you'll see here are a lot of databases. So if I just type tempdb, for example, you'll see databases. Well, you can see some on my screen there that you recognize. I have my SQL Server database engine is what we call the SQL instance in Operations Manager. Now these are assets in my CMDB. If I want to populate a query list in my self-service portal, I have new assets over here, and I'm just using that as a simple example. This could be anything that you've discovered over there in Operations Manager at the end of the day. So just know that this capability is at your avail, and it's very quick and easy to put together to beef up our CMDB with additional data, with additional information that it will allow us to further reduce the manual input we need from our users. We want their input, but we want it to be easy, so they just check boxes rather than typing lots of information, because that's going to be much more error prone. So let's have a look at the automated service delivery architecture. So I've got a nice 6-point diagram here. So it starts with importing the orchestrator runbooks into the Service Manager CMDB. That connector leverages the web service. Very simple. I'm going to create what we call a Service Manager runbook activity to enable the runbook to be called by Service Manager. I like to think of this runbook activity to be a little template of sorts. I'm going to publish my Service Manager request, a request offering we call it, to my self-service portal, so users can invoke that runbook simply by providing their input and hitting the submit button. And orchestrator in this scenario is out of sight, out of mind. So the perfect self-service strategy in the self-service portal is one in which the end user has no idea what's doing all of that heavy lifting in the background, because we've really just explained this process to our user in plain English how it's going to work. They don't have to worry about the technology they don't care about. I'm not going to teach them about runbooks and nesting runbooks and OData web services, etc., and CMDBs. Heaven forbid I pull out that CMDB, hey? So step 4, I'm going to, the user is going to invoke a request. So they hit the submit button. That sends that process going. Service Manager using the Orchestrator web service and the little runbook activity that I've nested within the template is going to trigger that service request, but pushing over some information as defined in our inputs, and then it's going to monitor that process as our automation continues and finally completes, successfully or fails. But the key points I want to get across here, from a self-service perspective, we need to, a user is going to initiate an action. So what Service Manager Self-Service Portal does is it really enables us to stop doing quite so much monitoring. Those monitoring type runbooks are always out probing things, looking for changing conditions. That's what we used to have to do in Service Manager 2010. So I had lots of monitoring style runbooks that, eventually add up. So now with the self-service portal, I have runbooks that are just sitting there waiting to be called when a user makes the request. So more efficient from a resource perspective. I'm going to collect my input from the user. I'm going to validate that input. Typically, if I'm doing it right, I'm going to validate that input right there in the UI to make sure they've given me real values, correct information. I'm going to record that information in a service request. And what's great about this is if I use Service Manager, I get these first 4 steps for absolutely free. All of this is done for me as I configure my self-service request offerings, and the recording of the service request just happens. And then I'm leaving just that last step to Orchestrator, which is actually executing, carrying out that automation. So to Simon's point, I don't necessarily need to use Service Manager as my CMDB. If you have a service desk solution in place today where people log incidents and changes and what have you, fine, leave it. Let's coexist with Service Manager as a rich data source, for lack of a better term. I can drive data from Service Manager over to those other systems if that's what I want to do. So I have a lot of flexibility there for coexistence over time.
Great. We've actually got a few questions come in, both related to the connectors as well as the coexistence.
Okay.
Let's kind of hit coexistence first here. Okay. So first of all, we want to make a clarification. Someone believes that you are saying Service Manager is required. Let's just clarify here. It's extremely important. Gives you a lot of benefits. Can you run the rest of the infrastructure without Service Manager? Yes.
Yes.
It's not required, but highly recommended.
Highly recommended.
Now, what if our customers are already using an existing ticketing system? Can we, integrate this with Orchestrator, with our other components as well?
So you can do this a couple of ways. So if Service Manager is an option, if you can live with that coexistence, so we can leverage that rich CMDB and the self-service interface, you can still drive those work items out of the other system. We can use Orchestrator to drive information from the Service Manager CMDB over to that remote system, generally speaking. Now, maybe in your environment, Service Manager just isn't an option. To Simon's point, no, it's not absolutely required. I'm a big fan, as you've heard. But that's where initiating runbooks from outside Service Manager, outside of Orchestrator comes into play. So I can use that PowerShell methodology that you saw earlier. I can do the same thing with .NET. Alternatively, I can use monitoring style runbooks to watch for new requests in the form of maybe a record in a database or a file in a folder. And I can pick that request up from the remote system, drive the automation, and then put a result back into that remote system potentially. So I have a lot of options for integration with those third-party systems that maybe aren't all that challenging, frankly. It depends on the system, but if we can get the information into a database, into a file of some sort, we have a lot of capability in Orchestrator to go find that information and to drive automation regardless of what the the initiating system is.
Great. A related question here regarding Operations Manager integration. So as we discussed earlier, Operations Manager can create an alert that can go, trigger things inside Service Manager.
Mm-hmm.
After the Service Manager has been processed, will that actually close that Operations Manager alert? Or is that just going to stay open and running and people will still see that as an active incident?
So you have two options when you configure that connector, and it's very straightforward. One of those options is to check a box when you're configuring the Operations Manager alert connector that says when the incident is closed, close the alert. I don't like that option. I'll explain why in a minute. The other option is to, when the alert is resolved, allow the incident to be resolved as well. That I do like, and here's why. Operations Manager implements stateful monitoring. So, for example, I'm monitoring a web application. It understands when the application is unhealthy and when it returns to health. That monitor is probing to tell us when it goes from green to red and back again. So Operations Manager understands the true state, and if I let that alert open and generate the incident, we just go fix the root problem as documented in the alert and by association the incident. When we fix the root cause, the alert is closed and the incident is resolved. It's a very natural course of action. On the other hand, if I go that first route and drive the closure of the alert from the incident being closed, I'm potentially creating a blind spot in my monitoring because I'm closing an alert associated with a monitor that's in an unhealthy state. What that means to you monitoring folks is I now have a monitor that's in a red state. I've already generated an alert and I've closed that, so it's going to remain in a red state until I go fix the root cause, except it's not going to alert me via email anymore. Blind spot, bad news.
Okay, good clarification there. A second clarification that's been asked is around the connectors that we have to Operations Manager. Is it a single connector, or do we actually have separate connectors for the configuration items and for the tickets?
There's an Operations Manager configuration item connector and a separate Operations Manager alert connector. So when you right-click connectors and you see the list of connectors, one, frankly, shows you the Operations Manager alert connector, the other Operations Manager CI connectors. So those are very two different interactions, so they each have their own unique configuration.
Great, and I think you've touched on this before, but a question came up again. Do you have any ODBC connectors as well?
So that comes in the form of the query database activity, which will connect into ODBC compliant databases. I can supply a string, I can connect into SQL, Access, Oracle, etc. So query database is where I would start with that if I'm trying to connect into remote data sources.
All right, great. One more question, and then we'll bounce back to the main topic here. So we have a customer that's a hoster here running Service Manager. They want to know if it's possible to have a CMDB for each of their tenants, each of their individual users. Essentially, can Service Manager support multiple CMDBs for different groups or organizations? Or how would you classify that if it has a single CMDB? What is the way to carve that up?
Yeah, so Service Manager has a single CMDB. We do have some capability in Service Manager from a role-based, from an RBAC, a role-based access control perspective, to kind of silo off groups of assets and work items, so configuration items and work items into queues basically. So if I want to sort of limit the visibility per customer, I can do some of that. If I'm exposing to them a full Service Manager console, which we'd never do in a service provider scenario, I'm not really going to be able to fully hide everything I would imagine I'd want to hide in that situation. But can we have a measure of coexistence there? I think the answer depends on data, isolation, privacy, etc., and making sure we can control the visibility. So I would say multi-tenancy needs to be approached with care. Particularly if we're not just talking about multi-tenancy in the inter-organizational perspective. I certainly have organizations that have 4 or 5 separate, distinct service desks, and we use role-based access and queues and views to sort of give each of those service desk units their unique experience in Service Manager. You want to be very careful as you're working through a hoster, customer-facing scenario there, and I think one of your most challenging elements is going to be giving them the right user interface if you expect to show them something out of the CMDB.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a great segue to our next demo, where we're really actually going to focus on, building these service requests, publishing them, offering them. Because we've had a couple of people that have just actually said, what does this look like from the end user experience?
Okay, so let's start with just a relatively simple but powerful and effective request offering. So something I hear all the time. We have these groups that we need to have rights, permissions to be placed into, so we have elevated access, perhaps for a period of time. We call that basically self-service resource access request, if I'm categorizing that in some way. So I'm just going to pop over here to my console where I have the Service Manager self-service portal open, and we'll look at that from the user perspective. Then we'll go look at how that was put together in the Service Manager interface. So I'll kind of take you through the steps for how we got it there. So
Great.
Here you see my categories in blue.
Now, what is a service request offering? How do we kind of differentiate it? Because I see this terminology mixed up quite a lot.
As do I, and that's a great point. So let me just show you an example of each and then explain what they are. So the categories are these blue headings that you see right here. These blue headings are actually contained in what we call a simple list, just a text-based list in Service Manager. I can go add, remove, change any of these that I like. So access and security, just to cover this off fully, I'll go find my lists. And I'm going to type category here because my list come in what we call a service offering category, which will lead us momentarily to our next question. What is a service offering and a request offering? So here I'll just add a little -MVA to that label, to that category. And I'll flip back over here to my self-service portal. I'll give it a quick refresh. And assuming that got written out to the database, give it just a second to finish, frankly. As soon as that category gets written out to the database, it's going to, I don't know that I actually saved it. Yeah, I did. So access and security. So within a very short amount of time, access and security will say access and security dash MBA. So we'll give it a couple of minutes here and that should show up, but I can make these whatever I want. I see some organizations that simplify the language to the point that they may just put something here to the effect of, I need access to a resource. I need to deploy a virtual machine. I need to do X. So we have full control over the language in the category. Now under each category you'll notice there are groups of offerings. We call these service offerings. A service offering is a collection of roughly related individual requests that we call request offerings. So within the Access Services service offering, I'll have multiple request offerings. So in this case, when we drill down, we'll see I have some SQL database access offerings and then Active Directory groups. And if I just back up a step, you'll notice that we've cordoned these off. So file share services, this is accessing a request. We decided to put this into its own service offering. Many times with the more with the less technology focused users, I will create more service offerings, and in one case I even created a one-to-one relationship between service offering and request offering so they could only go to one place. Virtual machine request, and they clicked that service offering, which took them to virtual machine request. So you want these tiers to be intuitive because this is the navigation. This is how you're navigating the user to the request that's right for them. So we want this to be as plain English as we can. And you notice that these have a particular icon. As we're configuring these, you can add the icons of your choice that correspond to whatever you like in your environment. So you can put the flashy new Microsoft flat theme in there, for example. But I've kind of laid these out in a way that's intuitive for me, and I have my private cloud self-service, and then I have my public cloud self-service, which actually deploys into Azure. So that's what it looks like on the user side, but let's drill down into that access request. So what happens behind the scenes? I request access to Active Directory groups. I'm going to ask this user some questions. I want to point out to you there's a couple of things I don't ask them. So I'm asking this user 3 questions. Give me your cost center. And this was a demo scenario, so I put cost center in there just because, frankly. This could give us tracking capability later. You'll notice here I can basically select one or more groups. These are security groups. These security groups are in what we call a query list that came that we put into Service Manager, populated it with the security groups that came to the CMDB via the Active Directory CI connector. So these were populated automatically. I didn't have to do any work beyond setting up that connector to synchronize, which is really quite simple. Now, I also, at my option, configured Service Manager to allow the user to drill down into more information, and I did that simply because I wanted them to be able to look to make sure that the group was exactly what they were looking for, that it wasn't a similarly named group somewhere else. All very easy and flexible. And then my last bit here is to ask them why they want this done. Needed for my job. Now what you'll notice here is I didn't ask this user who they are, and that's because I know who they are. We're leveraging Active Directory security, role-based access control and service manager. I picked up the user token and I know who this person is. I don't have to ask, which is great because it allows us to eliminate some potential proxy-based or man-in-the-middle type nonsense request, right? Because we know who you are. Which sounds a little bit ominous when I say it that way, frankly. And this request, if memory serves, is going to trigger a runbook that will will add the user to those groups, assuming we have approval. What I don't remember off the top of my head is if that approval is manual or automatic. So we'll go have a look at that in just a second. But I hit submit, and what happens in the background now is Service Manager is creating a service request. The first activity in this service request is probably the approval activity. So I'm going to hit view my request, and we're going to have a look at it here from the end user perspective, and I can look at my requests. So as this request comes in, here's the add user to requested AD group. Yeah, and if you look over here to the request activities, you'll notice it says approve user request for AD group membership, which if it's automatic, and there is actually an approval type called automatic, I like to put an approval step in there, and if I don't really need the approval today, I will frequently set the approval type to automatic, so it's there for future use.
I mean, what do you recommend as a best practice with this automated approval? You know, I hear some customers say, I want everything to be fully automated just to simplify this, you know, even additional overhead of going to a form, but that could kind of get them in trouble, right? If people are, say, provisioning VMs, consuming resources automatically. How do you scale that best practice?
Yeah. So from a process perspective, I think the distinction of not having an approval process and having an automated approval is us acknowledging as a service delivery organization that we are automatically approving this request, and at our option we may decide that we are not automatically approving these requests in the future, so we can go back and we can modify that request offering down in the template to put some other approval mechanism in there. Maybe we have, you know, a group of people. We have one approver or a group of approvers. So I'll just drill down into this request. So here is the service request for adding the user to the groups. We'll go look at what we call the review activity, which is the activity where the approval is driven from. This particular request is only going to have a couple of activities. It's going to have the review activity, and then it will have the activity that drives the runbook automation. Now I'm going to go up here and change from the diagram view to the list view, and you'll see why I do that here in just a second. You notice the list view lays them out so I can read everything that's going on. Notice that the activity, this is a sequential set of activities. You'll notice that the green arrow signifies this is the activity we're on right now, and when this one is complete, we will move to the next one. So this one is not automatically approved, so I put Haven Ford in here as the approver in this case. I'll just hit the drop down on the approval condition here. I just wanted to point out we've got automatic, we've got percentage, so I can set a subset of a group of people. I can mark some users as being required to vote and some users as having veto power potentially, based on whatever my ITIL process is. I'm going to go ahead and hit the approve button here and trigger this. So within a couple of minutes, that's updated in the CMDB, and the next activity in my UI, the actual runbook activity. And you notice the little the alpha prefix here, RA for review activity, RB for runbook automation activity, MA for manual activity, which brings up an important point. Created many a user onboarding process that's full. This interface here is full of manual activities, because we're not actually automatically doing anything. We are simply creating all of the manual activities so we can drive notification to the people that need to carry out a task associated with the provisioning process. So we may be first contacting the people that install the equipment in the office, that put the desk in there and the phone. And then when the desk is in place, the workflow progresses to the people who provision the computer, and so on and so forth. And I can build sequential activities. I can build also activities that run in parallel. So the important thing is not how I do that, but that I map out the process so I understand where the dependencies are in my process. So in this case, I happen to be driving runbook automation to actually go complete a lot of the actual work for this particular type of request. So incidentally, when that is done, I'll be able to come back in here. I'll see that the runbook activity is either green, the arrow is there indicating it's in motion, or potentially that it's even all the way done. So it looks like it's still in the process of thinking through its activities. So why don't we talk for a minute about how this runbook came together?
Now, first, a really good question that just came out here. It's really about granularity and providing different users access to different service requests and request offerings. Can we do that? For example, can our human resources department, I get to pick on them a lot, my fiance works for HR. For example, can our human resources department only see a certain set of requests? Can our engineering see different set? Do we have that granularity and control?
It's almost as though our viewer knew exactly where I was headed. So I'm going to walk you through the process of how this request went together. In that process, we're going to talk about how we can reveal only specific request offerings if we so choose. We can reveal only specific service offerings if we so choose. So we have granularity in the self-service UI to potentially hide some categories of service requests all together. So I could make this service request go away entirely, or maybe when I drill down, I want them to see that access services, but maybe I'm only going to show them the Active Directory groups, and maybe these were related to just my developers or something. So when we define permissions, which we do through something we call catalog groups, I actually define access at the request offering level, so down here in the collection of the individual offerings, as well as at the service offering level. So I have to grant permission at both levels in order for this to happen. There you see my back-end database, my workflow caught up. There's your -MVA. So I just wanted to point out, easily customizable, add new categories to your list, all within your view. And you see I'm on the category view. There's actually a list view that lists these all like this, and I can search. So I don't want to say that navigation is anything, but I'm a big fan of category view, don't know why. But you can also just go to list view and search. If you have a big service catalog, list view and plain English search are going to be the secret weapon for your users to just sort of intuitively search. If we've done a good job naming our request offerings and our service offerings in a way that map to what our users are expecting to see. I'm going to pop back over to my PowerPoint for just a moment to make sure we were actually to the demo. We actually are, so I'm not going to show you any more PowerPoint. I know you're disappointed. We're going to go down to service templates. So we're going to assume at this point I've put that orchestrator connector in place. I've synchronized my runbooks into my CMDB. Here they are. I can search for, I'm going to search for group. There it is. There's that add user to security group. That's my updated version. And you can see one of my teammates has very kindly let me know that he updated this and even put a note for what he updated. So what a prince of a guy.
Nice
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. So he actually just told me he did some stuff here to make it a little more reliable, frankly, which is great. So I'm going to go into my templates now. And I mentioned Service Manager is very much template based. And the first template we need to create is this little runbook activity template. So I'm going to just double click this and we'll get in here and look at this template. Now you notice when I double click this, it opens me up to a properties view of sorts where it says when I click OK, go ahead and open the template form. So I have kind of two steps to get into my template. So here I am in my runbook activity template. I'm going to browse over to, pardon me, into my runbook tab, where I will see the runbook that I selected from those in my service catalog. Now, I like to be very selective in synchronizing my runbook, so I have fewer to deal with. And I have over here I have 39 runbooks versus 500 or 600, if memory serves, in my live environment. So I'm keeping it simple, minimizing the bloat. Runbooks aren't huge, but it gets confusing if I sync 900 over, forcing people into a lot of search. You'll notice here that I basically have one property mapped in here, the runbook activity ID. So we see that this runbook's name is 2.1.2, add user to AD group dash, blah, blah, blah. This is all part of my naming convention in my environment. I'm going to pop over to Orchestrator and I'm going to show you that runbook. So you'll notice here that we sorted ours out in some cases by function. So a monitoring runbook is a runbook that is always monitoring for some condition. We have a lot of monitoring runbooks that deal with dynamic notification or other workflow activities. Ad hoc runbooks are those runbooks that sit there until some user makes a request, calling them into action. So here's our service access runbooks, and you'll notice it's not a runbook, it's several runbooks, right? And they're numbered sequentially. We have actually all of those request offerings, their runbooks are here in this tidy little folder mapping to that request offering. So here's add user to group. Little connectivity hiccup there. What that initialized data activity has behind it, it's asking for one piece of information, the runbook activity ID. And the reason I do that is really all I need to know is the ID of that runbook activity, and then I can go back to Service Manager using the get relationship activity to find the related service request for that runbook automation activity. So get relationship speaks to Simon's mention of the importance of relationships here. So everything is related. So that runbook automation activity is a child object within the service request. So I'm simply telling, an orchestrator here, go find the runbook automation activity with this ID and give me the information about the service request that it's contained within. And then I'm going to go get the service request, and then you notice I'm calling other runbooks, and I'm calling a runbook to basically go back and retrieve the affected user from that service request. And I'm actually parsing the input from that service request. The user inputs come in an XML form. I can easily parse those with a query XML activity in Orchestrator. Once I grab that XML for Service Manager, I'm going to do all of the slicing and dicing of the request based on the titles in my fields. Several examples of this on the internet for sure, and we saw some of these at the Management Summit and Tech Ed this year. And then you'll notice I'm using some Active Directory related activities. I'm getting the distinguished name of the user because I can query the user based on its your friendly name, its common name, but to actually take action on a user in Active Directory, or any object for that matter, I need its distinguished name. So I need to get the user's distinguished name, I need to get the group's distinguished name. And you notice here, I want to be transparent, so we're going to trigger this once for each group you picked in the UI. Now it's for me more than my end user. And then we're adding the user to the group, then I'm going to go update the request to say, hey, you're done. And here I'm just putting a little note in here to say what we did, frankly. So not a very complex runbook at the end of the day, but very intuitive for my user. All they had to do was to pick from those self-service groups, and for the few times I have seen that come up in the real world, I found that it's fairly easy to identify for these orgs to identify which groups are self-service type groups, and I've seen variations that even get down into temporarily granting access to a group and then automatically revoking some hours later, which is great because Orchestrator has an activity called check schedule. I can do some fancy work with check schedule to even add a workflow of sorts in here that will run for hours and go pull that user out automatically if that's what I want to do. And my user can come back here and check the status of their service request over time. I tend to like to drive the result back to them through email. And I typically like to build into my workflow some sort of notification to tell them that the request has been processed, it's in motion, and will get back to you in a few hours. I can do that with Service Manager through the native notification capabilities that come in the Exchange connector. I'll tell you, to be honest, I also like to use Orchestrator in conjunction with this because I can monitor for key activities and notify as well. Lots of people do that. But this native connector, I'd absolutely encourage you to really just take a native Service Manager approach and use the connector here to create templates, and we can drive notifications through the off-the-shelf capabilities. This Exchange connector, while it was beta or unofficial for a long, long time, is now officially supported. I have to create a notification template and run a little wizard to make this happen. We're really not going to go in depth into the notification capabilities of Service Manager, because that's an hour by itself. But point being, I can drive notification back as soon as that request is in progress. Service Manager can send a mail, say, hey, thanks for the request, it's in progress, we're going to be back to you soon, which eliminates that phone call from somebody saying, okay, I made the request, but I didn't see anything, I'm not sure what's up. That's what we want to avoid, right? We want a process that's free of that sort of friction and confusion at the end of the day.
Very nice. Well, I know tomorrow or on Thursday you're going to spend some time talking about chargeback, but we do have a few questions that have already come up, basically saying, can we show the overall cost of this request to that requester as they're going through this process?
So the short answer is not exactly. Chargeback is really related to self-service virtualization in that
to
context.
Infrastructure type
Right,
requests.
to infrastructure type requests. So now, to the degree I can assign a value to this particular request and track that value in Service Manager, sure, I could do that.
That could be maybe a time value of that person that would have done that task. Okay.
Right. Yeah, I could actually just establish some sort of ROI calculator that service request X has a cost savings value of $75, and that request was initiated and completed successfully 150 times, so my cost savings is X. So I could do that. I could pull that information out of Service Manager, maybe through Excel, some custom reports, and I could push that sort of information back to my organization, to the people that cared to see that sort of ROI data.
Great. Oh, we have another question from somebody that's working actually very closely with a lot of the developers, working with DevOps. So as part of our one of the Microsoft developer tools, we have Team Foundation Server, or TFS, which is kind of like a centralized, database, bug tracking, kind of project management system. Question that we have here is the integration point between Service Manager and TFS. So for example, if I get a service request that comes in saying, go fix this bug in this piece of code, how can we go integrate that with TFS?
So Orchestrator has a native point of integration with TFS in the form of an integration pack. So I can basically drive work items to TFS. Operations Manager, from a monitoring perspective, has a native point of integration in that when particular types of application failures are raised, we can
assign to engineering.
Yeah, we can bug those in TFS. Service Manager directly doesn't have that capability, but can I monitor for specific types of faults and drive that information to TFS with Orchestrator? Absolutely.
And that would even include closing the bug afterwards, again, via Orchestrator.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just not going to drive it directly out of Service Manager, but I can basically watch for specific templates where we've created a specific type of incident or service request or other template. So when I monitor for and find a work item that meets those conditions, it triggers the workflow, the runbook, to go take those actions in TFS. I
mean, from what I'm hearing, the answer to all these integration questions is often yes through Orchestrator. Again, so long as we have that programmatic interface, some way to automatically communicate, you can really automate pretty much anything in the data center.
Yeah, and you notice I'm trying to take care to tell you how from a step-by-step basis, because there is more than one way to achieve everything in System Center, particularly with Orchestrator. So I'm trying to give you the path of least resistance, so to speak. So definitely it's possible for us to use that template capability in Service Manager to have different templates, different types of work item templates for special types of incidents related to our code, which we can then monitor for with a monitor type runbook that's using the monitor object activity from the Service Manager integration pack, so we can spot those specific work items and drive that information to TFS, so we can kind of bridge that DevOps gap, so to speak.
Great.
So why don't we press on? I'm glad to hear so many questions. I'm really happy to hear you guys are here and engaged. Let's talk about virtualization self-service, just top of the mountain here, how we take those next steps. So here's that automated request fulfillment. So we're going to import our runbooks. We're going to build the new request offering. We're going to publish it to the service catalog, and then we're going to let our users drive request. They will create the request. It's going to invoke the runbook. Service manager is going to monitor the process and update when it's all said and done. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of these templates, and I just want to show you in the UI, point out some common stumbling blocks, etc. So we're going to start with templates, and at minimum, my request offering in the template, I'm going to have a review activity. I'm going to have a runbook automation activity, and again, that review activity is approval. Even if it's automatically approved, I'm making a statement there that this is an automatically approved service request per our ITIL standards, how we've documented this in our organization. If you don't know the answer to that, then it's a great idea to go back and have a discussion with the folks that implemented ITIL within your organization or are responsible for its implementation and upkeep. So we understand where we need approval and where we don't, and in those cases, what type of approval. Maybe I need one person, maybe I need the manager and the manager's manager. Maybe I need a board of people. So we want to get those answers figured out ahead of time so we can define a review activity and then our runbook automation activity. Now when I build my request offering, you can't see these very well, but I'm going to have the option to configure user prompts. I'm going to have the option to tell Service Manager what that prompt will look like. Is it a text string? Am I asking the user for a number? Is it a query list? Am I going to just show them a list of CIs from my CMDB that they can select from? Or am I going to use a simple text-based list? Frankly, I can do that as well. So I have all of those options as we build that offering out. I'm going to publish this offering. So again, I'm typically going to add that request offering to a service offering, which is by definition a collection of related request offerings. And I will use catalog groups, as we call them, to configure access to these for my self-service groups. It's not uncommon that folks come to the self-service portal and say, hey, my portal is empty. And that's maybe because we haven't granted them access. They don't get the keys to the kingdom by default. So certainly every authenticated user by default has capability to go to that self-service portal and log an incident to tell us that they need help. They don't have self-service access by default, by design, but they're going to see the offerings based on their user role and the groups we've added them to. The user roles are mapped to Active Directory, so role-based access control and service manager for an administrator. For the analyst role, that person at the service desk that needs to see the work items and the configuration items, but not the administration tab. We can do that with role-based security. The end user that will never lay eyes on the service manager console. That's all going to be handled with Active Directory integrated role-based security. We're going to run a wizard that will allow us to connect that Active Directory group to a role that has the appropriate access and scope in terms of what they see in their experience. This one's very important. We're going to provide access to the offerings at both the service offering level and the request offering level. So we have that top tier category. We have the service offering group. So we had the group of Active Directory and SQL based access request. We have a collection of a couple of virtualization self-service offerings. But at the end of the day, I'm going to gather that data up. I'm going to give them access there, and then to the individual offerings within, I'm potentially only going to provide visibility into a subset. So it's not a zero-sum game. I need to grant access at both tiers and to only that which I want them to see. But that is why you will see a catalog group at both the request offering level and the security at the service offering level. So at both levels, I have the capability to minimize visibility, and then my work there is going to show up in the portal. In the end, the portal is going to be simplified because I'm only showing the user the elements of the service catalog that are applicable to their job role within my organization. So I'm not going to show the finance folks self-service virtual machine provisioning because accountants probably aren't deploying virtual machines. And likewise, I may not show the IT folks HR, new user onboarding requests. All powerful in their own right, but they have very different audiences. So everything I do is absolutely tailored to the user that I'm working with here. So I'm going to give that a lot of thought. So monitoring progress. Let's talk about that for a minute. So we submit a request. Maybe we configure notification in Service Manager to notify the user the request is in process. Maybe we use the send email activity within Orchestrator, one of the standard activities, to send an email. I don't really care, frankly. We just want to make sure we notify users at an appropriate time. I can monitor the status of this request as an end user from the web-based interface, the self-service portal, My Requests node. I can monitor that same activity in the admin portal as an analyst, as an administrator. Service Manager has access to Orchestrator through that web service. It knows the job ID associated with this request, so it can track the progress over time and will eventually update that service request with the end result. And at the end, we can then send out an email notification to notify the end user and potentially associated responsible parties within IT based on the status of that request. So maybe we want to notify the end user of the success, but maybe we proactively notify somebody in IT of the failure so they can circle back to the end user. The end user maybe doesn't get an email about the failure, but IT goes back and said, hey, needed a little point of clarification with your request, let me help you out. And so we can sort of build in some notification for IT that helps them understand there's a problem before the user on the other end understands, to give us that perception of proactive customer service. If we're going to be a service-based IT department, notification is key. I want to make sure I'm avoiding those phone calls and avoiding unhappy people because they're confused because I didn't send them an email at the right time. So before we get into a self-service virtualization request offering, I want to walk through and just look at all of the elements of one of those more polished offerings in the service catalog. Let's talk for a minute about the Cloud Services Process Management Pack. So Microsoft released this as a way to give you a starting point, shall we say, some request templates that will get the ball rolling so you don't need to build your virtualization service strategy from scratch. You've got quite a few service request templates in there for provisioning virtual machines, capacity management, etc. These tend to be a little more PowerShell heavy, frankly, and it's not a crime to use PowerShell. We've got a lot of service manager activities that are native to Orchestrator with that service manager integration pack. So I may use this Cloud Services Process Pack as a starting point, but as I'm building my own activities, I'm probably going to spend a little more time with those native activities that aren't using PowerShell, and I'm going to use PowerShell a little bit less. At the end of the day, I want my runbook automation to be very intuitive for my team to support. We want to use the color coding for the success and failure paths. I want to label my activities and my links and my runbooks in a way that allows my broader organization to support my automation strategy. So it's not just 2 or 3 PowerShell gurus in the corner that are responsible for everything, because they may not be around forever, right? At the end of the day, I want to make this a well-documented process that has notification in the right places, that closes the loop with ITIL, so we have just better results across the board than we would have with point solutions and ad hoc scripting and little utilities that we would cobble together to make all of this happen outside of System Center. So that being said, let's get in and really just walk through one of these request offerings. I'll show you one of these, and we'll just walk through and talk about how this comes together in a bit greater depth.
All right.
I know that a lot of people in the world that I encounter at the Tech Ed conference, at the Microsoft Management Summit, every conference I go to, I have at least one 60-minute plus conversation that tends to center around these request offerings. So step 1, import your runbooks into Service Manager using that Orchestrator runbook connector. Be selective. Don't just point to the root and bring all of your runbooks in. Just bring the runbooks in that are interesting for self-service. So these are going to tend to be runbooks that are ad hoc style runbooks, meaning they're not monitoring for anything. They are ad hoc runbooks that are waiting for some sort of input. You remember the add AD user to group had this activity that was looking for my runbook activity ID, so it could go look up the related service request and retrieve the user input. That's a pretty good strategy at the end of the day. As I go down the list of runbooks here that are set up for service manager type activity. I'm in my service manager subset. Here are the two that you see in my catalog. You see deploy a new service. You see deploy a new service advanced. And yeah, you see that I'm attacking with that same strategy, runbook activity ID. You might ask yourself, why are you only passing over one field, Pete? Why don't you pass over all of the input that we got from the user right away? Excellent question. I'm glad you asked. The reason I do that is over time, I may need to evolve this request offering in some way. I may need to evolve this runbook in some way. If I come back to this initialize data activity and I add additional inputs, it actually breaks my connection over in Service Manager that I configured to put these, these two components together to connect the runbook to the request offering. So the reason I only use that runbook activity ID is now I can go expand that request offering however I want. I can go modify my runbook wherever I want. I've got one point of interface between these. I can very efficiently go query the user input from Service Manager because it's a single piece of XML. I'm going to pull that back. I'm going to use the query XML activities of Orchestrator to parse that input to get the information I want. The user input, incidentally, is actually contained in the self-service or in the Service Manager work item in the service request. So if I go to work items and I find one of these requests where I have triggered something, so let me find a closed service request, how about something we're not still working on. I can find my user's input from the form in here somewhere. So I'll just drill down and see if this one has some input. But long story short, if the service request has input, if I'm asking the user for some piece of information, it's going to be in this service request, and I'll be able to go retrieve that information in the form of the user input. And I'll pull it back and I'll parse it. Query XML is the activity in Orchestrator, which is going, and I want to just throw a little tip out there for you. The query XML activity uses what we call XPath queries. You may say, but I'm not an XPath query expert. Well, I could spell XPath query when I started, and I went to w3schools.com and I looked for their XPath tutorial, and about 15 minutes later I said, hey, this is pretty easy, and I was parsing XML documents with relative ease. So it's relatively IT pro friendly. So don't be overwhelmed by that particular reality, but that's what my runbooks all tend to do from a self-service perspective. These first three activities are the same in just about every runbook I build, so I don't have to think about it much, which for your purposes means that if you build that strategy to go, once we have accepted the runbook activity ID and we look up that related service request, you just have to decide exactly how you want to parse the user input, how you want to retrieve it and parse it. You do that once, you now have a repeatable, reusable, modular runbook that we can work right into this process. So it's going to be highly reusable, and we only have to figure it out one time. Plenty of nice samples for you out there on the internet. So that's going to be fairly important. But I wanted to cover off why those first three activities are always initialize data, get runbook activity ID, service request relationship, and get service request. That gives me the target with everything I need to know about what this user is asking for. So let's get back to Service Manager. You've seen the runbooks, so to speak. I'm going to go down into my library. So the library is where my templates live, right? So I'll go down into my templates, and the first template I'm going to create, there's actually a create template activity. The first template I would create in this respect is going to be this runbook automation activity template, and there you see it. So when I do this, it's going to ask me to, and I'll just say my RBA template. I tend to name these templates with RBA template in them so I can tell the difference between a runbook activity template and a service request template and an incident template. So it's not complicated. I just need names that are intuitive based on the type of item I'm working with. So this will open my runbook activity template. I go to this tab. I'm going to go select the runbook I'm working with. So I think we called these something related to services. Yeah, so here's deploy new service. So I would pick that, and I would map my runbook activity ID. I'm going to edit the mapping. So At the end of the day, the runbook activity ID is all I care about. You see there's just a bunch of gibberish in here, and at the end I don't care about all of this. I just want that one particular ID. So once I've mapped that RBA ID you see in there, that's what my runbook activity template needs to look like. What I've now done is created a template that will allow me in request offerings to build, to reuse this however I like. So that's not actually the runbook activity, that's kind of a template that I'm going to reuse as I build my requests. So I'm going to look for those service requests that I was working with. So bear with me one moment here.
As you're filtering that, I just want to remind our viewers out there, we have one final poll of the day. If you're in full screen mode, we'd really appreciate it if you could minimize, answer this last poll, and of course give us awesome feedback.
Be honest, but generous.
Good, well put, well put.
So I'm going to look at my template here. So I have my deploy a new service request template. So this is the second template I'm going to create, which I would do with that same wizard. I would create template, and instead of selecting runbook automation activity, I would select service request. I bet you would have guessed that. There it is, service request. And I just want to look at the end result of that service request template, my step 3 more or less in this process. I'm going to give it some sort of meaningful name, and again, you want to think about your naming conventions. Put using description fields, just real common sense stuff here. Put enough information in here that when you go home and go to sleep and wake up the next day, you don't have to remember anything. You're going to build many runbooks and many service offerings, and eventually the buffers will overflow. First in, first out. So I'm going to go over to my activities area where I'm going to add activities. This little plus sign is how we add these activities, by the way. So review activity, I'll just type review activity. There's the default review activity. That results in this thing right here. The review activity, which I give a friendly name, and I define my approval condition. There you see my famous automatic approval. Big fan. Gives us flexibility to come back and add manual approval criteria later if our process evolves in such a way that we need to do that. The next activity, deploy a new service. This is the runbook automation activity here, so I'm just going to type runbook, and I can add my runbook automation activity into the process. So I'll drill into my runbook automation activity here, go over and have a look at the runbook, and there you'll see the string that maps out to that ID that we were talking about. So that's kind of done for me by virtue of that template I created in a previous step. And this is really all you absolutely have to do. You need that runbook automation activity in there. The approval activity, the review activity, we call it, is optional. I'll stop kind of beating that horse. Now I want to show you here the PA prefix means parallel activity. So just to point out that I can put a parallel container in here, and I can have multiple streams of activity happening at the same time. I want to just caution you that if I use parallel activities, I can't call a runbook down there in the middle of the parallel activity. So I want to make sure I call my runbook out before I'm doing that. And there are certain combinations where we can work around that can take that away as a general point of feedback, that trying to stuff a runbook activity down there in the middle of a parallel activity tree, it's not going to work out for you. So we want to be careful about that.
We had a question just come in. I think you kind of touched on this, but just to clarify, can we have different groups of approvers? Step 1 has to be approved by the storage guys, step 2 by the networking guys, etc.
That is an excellent question. So yes. So maybe we have tiered approval processes, and so group 1 has to make some approvals before we even bother with group 2, right? So maybe the storage guys make the approval, and then we go to the virtualization people, and then to the management layer, to the people that are paying the bill. At the end of the day, all I do is hit that plus sign and I add multiple review activity. So at the end of the day, I can create a tiered strategy that maps to what makes sense in my organization. I'll call this tier 2 approval. So I can be very flexible in defining approval strategies that maybe aren't don't fit into that tidy box of automatic approval. So what you'll see I'm doing here, the other reason I like the list view, I have this little handle here. I'm just going to drag that approval up here, and I'm going to put it right after the first review activity. Let me try that one more time. There we go. And so now I have my Tier 2 approval. I just have to get that sort of drug in there just right. There we go. So now I have tiered approval. Problem solved. I can drill in here, and I just need to define who those approvers are, who must vote, who has veto power, and what my approval conditions are. Is this a unanimous situation, or can a subset of these people vote? And the answer is, that's up to you, but either is acceptable. So tiered, low-hanging fruit, no problem. So we define the runbook activity. We create that runbook activity template. We've created our service request template. We've got our runbook automation activity in there. We have our approval in there optionally. Now we need to think about the service catalog. So you'll notice there's a service catalog node in the library workspace as well. It contains request offerings and service offerings. You'll notice there are draft request offerings, which would be those that have not been yet published. And we have those that are published. So I'm going to go look at the published version of these deploy a service runbooks that are leveraging my service templates that I created earlier in Service Manager. So here's my request a new service. This is the simple version. And I'll just basically, to create a new request offering, we can create that right here with the create request offering. I can actually make a copy of a request offering, and I'll tell you where I've used that. Remember that security group access request? I had a customer where we deployed that, and they said, hey, we really need to automate our VDI. We need to allow users to be able to request access to pooled desktop collections through the portal. I made a copy of that request offering, and I pointed it at a different collection of groups. And you'll actually see how we populate that query-based list here in a bit. But I populated it with a different list of groups that had the names of desktop collections. And so really I hadn't done much of anything, but in their mind, the end user now had a very intuitive way they could go request access to virtualized desktop or session-based resources. So let's just drill into this particular request offering and kind of look at this from the back end. So bearing in mind that this request offering, when we look at the front end, I'm going to drill down to it for you, is right here. So it's down in this private cloud service offering. It's the request a new service, not the advanced version. The advanced version had some fancy cost center info in there, so I'm not really going to hang you up on that. So you see we're asking the user for particular pieces of information. Now I can control all this. You notice that in parentheses here we have example. I'm a big fan of examples. Give your users in the little heading there an example that tells them what's okay and what's not okay. So this can be my dev service, for example. I can put my cost center. Big fan of drop downs for cost centers. I can also, through advanced asset management add-ins for Service Manager or that CSV import capability, even make this a drop-down experience. I could even use a simple list. You see I have my service templates. So these come over by default. What doesn't come over is the release. For me, the release was critical. If you come back and visit with me on Thursday, I'll happily show you how we bridge that gap because then my users can come in here and deploy different versions of the service. So it gives us a new flexible capability. So back to the request offering here. I digress. So I'll come back here and I'll look at my request offering. Here are the user prompts. I add user prompts by adding prompts. I just click down here and you notice it always adds an extra line. I type the name. So you notice that what I type in this field is exactly what's going to appear here. So service name with my example is exactly what we see back up here at the top. And you notice that it's not red anymore. That's because I marked it as a required field, and Service Manager flags anything that's required in red. That cost center, you notice, is a number, so if I put a letter in here, I marked that field as an integer because I have an idea that an integer is going to be a nice round number. So after I typed that in, I use the drop down here to pick string, text, to pick integer. So my service templates, you notice I'm using query results there because I didn't want to make the user type the name of the service request, because in my mind that's a nearly impossible task. I could give them a simple text-based list, but that would be a very static, a very, what do I want to say, undynamic solution to make up a term, because I'm going to have to go back and update that list every time I create new service templates in my environment. So I wanted to do a query results option, which allows me to configure the list of service templates they can pick from. And then you notice I have here a couple of other text-based options there that aren't all that interesting. But I wanted to get in here and show you the next step, which is configuring the prompts. So let's configure string and just have a quick look at what we get off the shelf with Service Manager. So I'm configuring a text control. You'll notice that I can limit the string length. I can do some sort of validation here if I've got email or phone numbers, or if I needed to do something more specific, I can use regular expressions. Very easy to do, and I find that I forget much of what I know about regular expressions every time I sleep, and the internet reminds me. So don't really take it too hard if you're not a regular expressions expert. I say there are a lot of things that I'm an expert in for a limited amount of time, and that expertise evaporates as I sleep, but the internet is always there to remind me, and I'm pretty good with the internet after many years. So I actually, let me just take a step back and make sure you saw what I did while I was yammering on there. I highlighted that service template, that query-based list. I hit the configure option here, and I went right to configure criteria. Now I didn't select service request here because I actually selected that the first time I created this. You would actually type service template or whatever the name of it was. Now I think I brought in something custom to get those extra fields. Oh, I'm lying to you. Right here, the default selection is frequently used basic classes. I need to set this to all basic classes so I can actually find the service template in the list. So you may ask, what is a frequently used basic class? Yeah, you'd have to ask Service Manager that question, because I didn't make that decision. I don't know. So let me just type service template again, and this will pull up my service template. Again, it's going to give me the core properties of that service template, excluding the release. But we can fix, and that's not even a bug, that's a by design thing, and we can fix this through a little connector magic, which I'll show you as time allows on Thursday. I've kind of built this in. So I need to basically find that service request in the list. When I get over to the configure criteria tab, here's where I can begin to configure how this comes together. So on the configure criteria tab, what you'll see is I'm building a formula. So I selected up here, object status does not equal pending delete. Well, what the heck is pending delete, Pete? Well, I'm glad you asked. Service Manager manages the life cycle of our assets. So when you remove the Configuration Manager agent, when you remove the computer object in Active Directory out of the path, out of the OU structure from where we're pulling, because I can pull information from Active Directory at an OU level. When Service Manager sees that source object from the authoritative source is no longer there, it says, hey, it must be retired. I'm going to go ahead and mark that as pending delete, which implies that it is not actually deleted. It's there for your approval. Service Manager never deletes anything without your permission. That being said, once we are comfortable with the process, we can use nice accompaniments like the Service Manager command shell, PowerShell interface to automate that process to just go remove the pending delete items in bulk, or we can use Orchestrator. However we're comfortable. But you notice that my first criteria here is does not equal pending delete, because I don't want to put service templates into the list that have maybe been removed from Virtual Machine Manager and marked as pending deletion. Now I actually have a custom, service template class extension here. Don't worry about that. That's where I added the release into my template. And so basically I said if it's my custom service class extension, I want you to, and it's true, I want you to pull that into the list automatically. So I can go in and pull other classes in if that's what I want to do, to bring in, like security groups, for example. So I can actually flip over and look at the security group with you in a minute. Now I'm going to map some prompts here if I need to. Typically I only need to map prompts as it relates to objects, to things that I'm putting in a query, things that are not query-based lists. So I can map text-based fields into specific interfaces, into specific fields within the request. The service template in this case, which is an object in a drop-down, it's an asset. It's not going to be a text value put into a list in the service request. It's actually an object. It's going to be attached to this request as a related item of sorts. It's again that object, class object relationship capability. So let me just show you here. I'm back there on that query results where I configured that information. What I didn't do was show you, number one, the columns I'm going to display, and you'll notice here I chose to display the description and the name and the ID and the release. So I wanted to get those fields that made sense. Now look at option 4. Add user-selected objects to template object as affected configuration item. So I'm telling Service Manager this isn't a text string, it's an object. You know it's an object, so we're going to attach it as a related item. And that's exactly how these work. Now when you're using query-based list, populating items right out of your CMDB, this is going to be really important. If you don't check this box, you're going to get a nasty prompt when you try to save your work. This right here. Output of every prompt should be mapped to a property, etc., etc. I broke the rule. Since we can't map an object to a text field, I need to go back, check that box, save my work, and deal with it. So I've broken enough in here talking to you, but that's going to be the key box. So remember, when you build a query-based list of CIs, go to that Options tab and check the box. Because I promise you, if you don't, you're going to get the errors as I got them for a long, long time, and had to sort through that. So that's the request offering. Now I need to put that into a service offering. This is a surprisingly easy task. I will go look at my published service offerings, and I have my private cloud self-service provisioning service offering where I put my request offerings, my individual items that people can request. Now you'll notice that a service offering has a couple of things here that are going to be interesting to you. The first is the category. Remember that simple text-based list we looked at? Mm-hmm. You notice I've picked data center and cloud services. I have other categories I could put this into. So if I wanted to move this to access and security, if I lost my mind and decided this was no longer self-service provisioning, in a couple of minutes time I could basically move it up to that top category if that's what I wanted to do. I don't want to do that, to be very clear, so I'm going to leave it right where it was in my data center and cloud services. I'm going to give this service request category an intuitive name, a nice description, so when the user mouses over this, it gives them an idea of what the heck is in here that they might be interested in. Now you'll notice on the request offering tab, I can hit the add button and I can add request offerings. So I'm bringing in the offerings. They're going to be in this logical collection. So I like to think of the category as the highest level of separation, and then I have the subcategories in the service offerings, which are the buckets or containers of related request offerings that a user can drive and are manifested in the creation of a service request.
Now, we have a lot of customers that are hosters, working in different environments, different locations. Do we support, say, Active Directory federated services for different companies, for users from one company to make service requests of other companies?
So I don't want to overstate capabilities. What I will say is Service Manager's Active Directory connector supports my connecting into multiple Active Directory environments. So if I have the capability, from a trust perspective, to assign Active Directory users permissions. Certainly
trusted permission.
Right,
okay.
right. Yeah. In order to configure Active Directory integrated, role-based security, I have to have access to those security principles, right? So if we're talking about completely separated environments, that's going to be very challenging. But if I just want to bring the configuration items into Service Manager, as long as I can supply some credentials at work, I should be able to sort that out. But are we going to use Service Manager for multi-tenancy across, unrelated groups of users in a full service provider scenario? I think you're going to have to define that on a very granular basis and do considerable testing. I think it's going to be unlikely that if you're supplying the user broad access through a user interface that you're going to make them very happy. Now, in that service catalog, I'm reasonably confident if they log in somewhere and they have an identity that they can authenticate to the self-service portal, I can carve that portal up to only show them what matters to them. If I'm not giving them a Service Manager console, then I'm not really in danger of showing them a bunch of assets that don't belong to them, right?
So could you maybe, I'm just kind of thinking out of the box here, but could you in theory give them a, self-service user account in Active Directory on the trusted site? They would go log in using that account, and if you have a new member that joins the original site's team, you can use Orchestrator to automatically go add them through this federated Active Directory.
So if they can authenticate to this self-service portal, I have full confidence that I can hide from that user. Configuration items in my CMDB, I don't want them to see in the context of these service offerings. I have confidence that in my runbook automation that's doing the heavy lifting in the background, I can build into their adequate air checking to look for the conditions, the variance in my process, to make sure that I'm not allowing a user to request some provisioning activity to which they shouldn't have access based on their role in their organization. So self-service, I could certainly drive a lot from a hoster perspective. It's really when we get into that full interface and trying to abstract certain elements of the CMDB where we're in the UI, that's just not going to be tenable at all, in my opinion. So you can take that with a grain of salt. You might find somebody that disagrees. I think you'll have to look pretty hard. But from the self-service portal, if I can authenticate, I can obfuscate, I can hide those things that I don't want them to see. So I've created at this point the runbook. I've imported my runbooks via the connector. I've created the runbook automation activity. I've created the service request template. I've created the request offering, which in its ultimate form will be published. They're going to be in draft form until I flip that field to published. And I can actually go unpublish if I so desire. If I find something that is deficient in a request offering, I can always go flip that field from published back to draft, and it now disappears by virtue of the fact that it's no longer a published item. So I've put that request offering into the service request. I created the appropriate category for that service request. So now we need to grant visibility into these items. So I create a self-service user role, Active Directory security, Active Directory integrated role-based security. And I have basically some self-service users here. Here's my end user request role. What I'm going to do is, using catalog groups, give this role the capability to see the items I want them to see. So I'll go to catalog item groups, and you'll see that I have catalog item groups that actually contain specific offerings. So data center and cloud service offerings are in that catalog item group. And you'll also notice data center and cloud services request offerings. So I can control which request offerings they see and which service offerings. So I'm just going to go look at those catalog groups with you briefly. And we will find here my data center and cloud service offerings, where I'm going to add included members. I added them statically here. So what you'll see here are my self-service provisioning offerings. I can also, incidentally, create dynamic query-based formulas that will populate this group very dynamically. And I have a carbon copy of this that contains request offerings instead of service offerings. So here I have those request offerings that you probably recognize pretty well by now, and it's only when I've closed this off by giving that role, that self-service user role, access to those catalog groups, and I've added the appropriate secure service and request offerings to those groups, that I've closed the loop, that I've granted the portal access. And there we have now a fully functional service and request offering published to our catalog. And the rest of this is actually something we've covered off already. So you remember when we created those self-service roles in the UI, we had to update our roles in Virtual Machine Manager to grant access to the templates and the Fabric resources. I'll call that largely done. And again, users can have membership in multiple roles. We're not going to do that one again just because we've already done that. And at the end of the day, we now have a fully functional self-service offering in the catalog, abstracting all of that underlying technology we were talking about this morning that would just send many of our less technical users into a tailspin. So really abstracting all the technology in an ideal self-service experience.
Excellent.
And that's what I know about optimizing self-service in System Center 2012.
Very nice, very nice. Well, we've reviewed a lot here. Wow, a lot of information, and we still had a lot of kind of questions coming in here. Let me see. So first of all, kind of the big one we have here is talking about our customization and our extensibility across these, different components, right?
Mm-hmm.
What could people do to really kind of optimize this environment, add their own plugins, add their own extensibility? So maybe, a good way to approach this is kind of go one by one. So first of all, let's talk about Orchestrator. I have my own line of business application. What can I do to go and automate this?
Yeah, so when we think about automating a line of business application, it's understanding the APIs. How do we talk to that application? If it's provisioning, updating, etc. If I'm talking to an ERP application, for example, it probably has a database. So the query database activity might help me. And then again, it may have a .NET API that would be accessible to me with PowerShell or with C#. So I'd have some options there. I tend to go the PowerShell route because I can make PowerShell do what I want and I'm not a developer. But you need to find the window in, is the answer there.
Now, what about building your own integration packs?
So you can certainly build your own integration packs. And if you had, for example, a PowerShell script or a chunk of C# code, the Orchestrator integration toolkit gives me a wizard-based experience where I can turn a PowerShell script into an Orchestrator activity in a custom integration pack that I can drag and drop onto the palette. That's the CLI version of that wizard. There's an SDK version that will allow a developer to use C# or VB.NET to the same end.
Great. Now, what about System Center Operations Manager? I know we can have management packs. What else can we do as far as customization?
So if we're customizing for self-service, are we thinking, or?
Just general. Basically, the questions here are around extensibility. I like these products. I want to go and customize it for my own environment.
Yeah, so Operations Manager has Visual Studio authoring extensions and also a Visio-based authoring experience, so we can build custom management packs. So for quick and dirty, IT pro-friendly authoring, if I want to build a management pack that automatically identifies my custom web application, its database role, etc., based on registry keys or WMI queries, I can build that very easily in that Visio-based authoring experience. Hit the save button, save that off as a management pack. The Visio authoring experience validates that it meets the requirements, and then we can import that management pack into Operations Manager, and the discovery process begins. We're off and running.
Excellent. Now, how about data visualization using Operations Manager? Can we create our own dashboards and dashboard views?
Yes, yes, yes. So I published, for example, just on my own, a collection of dashboard views for Active Directory that would show me various aspects of physical and logical health, and actually also gave me a service level dashboard view to show me in a nice, fancy dial what availability of my Active Directory was. Similar for the physical and logical components of my Exchange environment. So in a matter of a couple of hours apiece, about half a day, I had built a collection of half a dozen dashboard views for each, and I never left the Operations Manager Operations Console. So I was all UI with that.
Nice. Now, talking about Service Manager, people are pretty interested in the Service Manager portal. Already answered a few questions about different language options that are available. But how about custom branding for that portal?
Now, that's a great question. That's a really common question. So the extensibility of that portal is limited. I can go in, I can change the corporate logo. So I'll be very clear about that. If you want your corporate logo there, great. I can change the fonts. I can change the color schemes. I've even taken that top pane that says need help and I've turned that into an announcements window where I drove announcements. I can put some URLs in there. Now, can I take that and move a bunch of web parts around and fundamentally change the look and feel? Absolutely not. So it's really going to be basic customization, to be honest.
Excellent, great. Now, as we wrap it up, this kind of hits the key questions that we've had all day. Very briefly, what are you going to be covering on Thursday as part of part 2 of this presentation?
So as part 2, we're going to move into some new areas of the process, but we're not really going to abandon private cloud. We're going to move into a hybrid strategy and talk about initially monitoring our private cloud. So we've set up a lot of moving parts here. We need to monitor the performance of our cloud, the capacity of our cloud, to understand, how we're doing just at the fabric layer, right? Because we did some thin provisioning back there, if I remember correctly. Storage spaces let me provision a terabyte when I only had 100 gigs of storage. So eventually, I'm going to have to pay for that check I wrote. So we'll talk about monitoring, and we'll move in to self-service from a hybrid perspective. So in Service Pack 1 with System Center, I can take, I can deploy virtual machines directly into Azure. I can also take a virtual machine in my VMM environment, deployed to Hyper-V. I can store it in my library and then move it up to Azure automatically. So we'll have a look at some of what we can do in that respect.
Excellent. Well, as I kind of summarize, what we've hopefully showed you today that you've taken away, first of all, a brief introduction to some of the System Center components. In fact, it wasn't a brief introduction, it was a pretty thorough introduction here. Now, what we really hope to show you is these different levels of building our servers, building our fabrics, and building this self-service. From the end user's perspective of, I need something from my infrastructure, down to that kind of infrastructure specialist as far as here's what I can provide, and then tying those pieces together with our automation glue. So thank you so much for joining us, Pete. It's been a pleasure having you. I want to thank our support team who have been great, as well as our producers here in the studio. With that, please make sure that you check back regularly at www.microsoftvirtualacademy.com, as we have lots of courses, 2, 3, 4 coming out every month in the near future, looking at all of our different System Center and Windows Server products. And middle of July, we're actually having jump starts dedicated to Windows Server 2012 R2 and System Center 2012 R2. With that, I would also ask you if you can please complete the poll that we have at the bottom of the page by minimizing your screen. It gives us some great feedback. We will stay on the line for a little bit longer to wrap up some of these existing questions. With that, Pete, thank you so much for coming. It's been great, and I'm sure Thursday is going to be an excellent session as well.
Yeah, absolutely, my pleasure. Plenty of tips and tricks coming for you on Thursday. I look forward to seeing you back.
Thanks a lot.